The speechwriter for the original George Bush and collaborated with him on his autobiography. He co-authored a satirical novel with Lynn Cheney. He wrote the official profiles of Bush and Cheney for the 2001 inauguration. People in Washington may know him best for his articles in Washingtonian magazine over the past decade or two. And now people are going to know him best as a longtime Republican who got so fed up with the state of the George W. Bush administration and the current Republican Party that he wrote a book called, with his usual subtlety, Invasion of the Party Snatchers, How the Holy Rollers and the Neocons Destroyed the GOP. It's available at all fine bookstores and online book services. Please welcome the author of Invasion of the Party Snatchers, Vic Gold.
Thank you, David, and I want to thank you and the CATO Institute for inviting me to speak here today, and I want to thank all of you for coming here to hear me. I will start. Invasion of the. This is not my first book, as David pointed out. It was fairly obviously my most difficult book. I wrote it not as a labor of love, but as a labor of necessity. To keep my blood pressure, back in the Bush campaign, one time we got in a heated argument in one of the discussions, and camp strategy discussions. And I was the most heated of the crowd, and when it was all over, went in the side room. I had Jim Baker. Jim, would you mind if I dropped down on the floor and did some push-ups? He said, why is that? I said, well, my doctor told me whenever I get 2 up, push-ups would be good. Well, by the time I got to about 50 or 60 with this administration, I figured I had to do something if I was going to stay alive, other than do push-ups, because beyond 50 was too much. Difficult because I was not just, I've written critical books in the past, critical political books, and I've written critically of Republicans as well as Democrats. But this was personal obviously it was personal. As David said, I was called on to write the profiles for the first inauguration in 2001 of both Bushes and both Cheneys. Both the families were, I felt close to both of them, and I still do feel close to both of them. And one of the things that bothered me as I wrote this book was how Bush the elder was going to take it, because I had a pretty good idea, and have a pretty good idea right now, how Bush the elder feels about what's going on, although he hasn't confided in me or in anybody else that I know of. But at the same time, it's his son, which has to be twice as difficult for him to absorb. I was concerned about him, and before the book came out, I wrote him a note, told him the book coming out, he was not going to care for it too much, that it was critical of the course of the Republican Party in the past 10 years, and of the, I gave him the name of the book, and he wrote back and told me that nothing could break up our friendship. And then, this is the first time I'm going to say this, but it wasn't a confidential note of it, he said, and besides, I don't think too much of the neocons myself. He wasn't giving any secret away. We pretty much knew that. The book, a great deal was made in the Washington Post story about the book being critical simply of this administration, of the Bushes and of the Bush and Cheney aspect of the Bush-Cheney, what I called in the book the Bush-Cheney White House, because that's what it is. It is a co-presidency. A great deal is made of that, but actually, if you read the book, it starts out with the course of the Republican Party since 1980. 1980 was the moment at which what we call the Reagan revolution, but which was really the Goldwater-Reagan revolution came to an end. It should have been at the 1980 Republican convention. That was a high point. We'd won. But a Hegelian spirit invaded that convention, because within our victory was the seeds of our own destruction. By that I mean, it was at that convention that the neocons and the theocons, what I call in the book holy rollers. That's a little over the top, as somebody said. Somebody may think that's pejorative, but there's a little of the Ann Coulter in all publishers, and they thought that kind of language would be fairly appropriate. But the neocons and theocons moved in. Now, who were the neocons? Pat Buchanan describes them well. The neocons, you know, when we Lee Edwards and I and others in the audience were working for Goldwater, the neocons were over there with Lyndon Johnson. That's who they were. As Pat Buchanan described them, they are boat people from the McGovern campaign. When they lost their influence with the Democratic Party, when the radical left took over, they came right in. But they just didn't come in. Irving Kristol just doesn't come into a place and say, well, here I am, what can I do? He comes in, walks right down the center aisle and says, this is the way you've got to do it. And as a matter of fact, I'm sure you know, he even wrote an article calling the Republican Party, the Conservative, the stupid party. But he was going to correct us. Those were the neocons. Now, who were the theocons? The theocons were, as we recall, Jimmy Carter Democrats. Pat Robertson had brought them in, but with the ruling in the Carter administration on Bob Jones University, Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell became disillusioned, so they came in. Under Ronald Reagan, they had the neocons had no influence at all. The theocons had some limited influence. We will remember we had a Secretary of Interior, James Watt, whom my friend Bob Orban says, you remember James Watt? A man shouting in what was formerly the wilderness. But Ronald Reagan, and as I quote in the book, Reagan gave, as Mike Deaver told Lou Cannon, I believe it was Mike Deaver, Lou Cannon, Reagan understood that although in his heart he might feel akin to the religious right in some ways, he understood that politically speaking, you couldn't follow their theo-political course. And he would give them what Mike Deaver said would be symbolism. Well, that was during the 80s. Then came another election that we all celebrated. That was the victory in 1994.